The 12 Apostles rejected Paul. James J. posted a challenge against the Jesus Words Only principle. He wrote a message in October 2016 that contended, surely the apostles would have caught on to these details, i.e. the claims that Jesus spoke against Paul in Revelation 2, in Matthew 5:17, and in Matthew chapter 24 verses 4 through 5 and verses 24 through 27. Or why would God allow Paul's writings to be a part of what is known to be the Bible for about centuries? Here is my reply. Reply proving apostles rejected Paul. However, the 12 apostles did catch on, a fact that Paul's Jesus of Damascus tried to delay taking place as long as possible. The earliest church that traces to the 12 apostles, known as the Ebion, the poor, did exclude Paul from canon, a well-known fact that is generally ignored. Here are 12 proofs. 1. After the Jesus of Damascus visited Paul on a road outside of Damascus, Paul rushed to Jerusalem to see the 12 apostles and to tell them what happened. However, the Jesus of Damascus told Paul in a trance at the temple that the 12 apostles will not believe he met with the true Jesus, and this Jesus told Paul to leave Jerusalem without meeting them for that reason. See Acts 22:14 through 22. This strange fact is discussed in full at this link. Importantly, ask yourself, why could the Jesus of Damascus not simply have appeared to the 12 as he did to Paul and convinced them Paul met the true Jesus? Why did this Jesus know the 12 would think Paul did not meet the true Jesus? Once you have this question in mind, then all the subsequent proof of the 12's ultimate rejection that Paul was truly in prophetic contact with the true Jesus makes sense. Even Paul's Jesus predicted this, yet Paul's Jesus felt incapable to intervene to change their minds. Then who do you think this so-called Jesus was whom Paul met outside of Damascus? 2. Then, 3 years later, Paul went to Jerusalem and spent a brief time with Peter over 2 weeks. There Paul also met James, the brother of Jesus, but no other apostles. Galatians 1:18, Galatians 1:19. Paul speaks about a point up through 14 years where he can still brag in all of his encounters that the apostles, quote, imparted nothing to me, unquote. Galatians 2:6. In context, this was said to the Gentiles to prove, apparently, that Paul's revelations from the Jesus of Damascus alone suffice. 3. Then in Acts 9:26 through 31, apparently 14 years after this 3-year visit according to Galatians 2:1, Paul is brought to Jerusalem by Barnabas and introduced to the 12. But the 12 apostles still had the same disbelief and lack of trust in Paul. Quote, and Saul, having come to Jerusalem, did not try to join himself to the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, not believing that he is a disciple. Young's literal translation. 4. Luke records no positive apostolic response in Acts 9 verses 26 through 31 to Barnabas' introduction of Paul to the apostles. All Luke records is their distrust, and Barnabas' introduction of Paul, and then it moves into the general peace of the church since Paul's persecution stopped. But Luke says nothing about the 12 accepting Paul as a believer, let alone as a 13th apostle of the true Jesus, which Barnabas' speech does not claim for Paul. Luke provides an entirely mute response from the 12 other than the rejection of Paul cited in verses 26 through 31 quoted above. 5. Luke's negative-only response from the 12 is consistent with Paul's record of this first meeting of all 12 after the Damascus experience. For in Galatians 2:6, Paul recounts that after meeting with the apostles, leaders of the Jerusalem church, that the apostles still imparted nothing to me, and the esteem others had in them meant, quote, no difference to me, unquote. 6. This distrust of Paul by the apostles continued. First James, the bishop of Jerusalem and the brother of Jesus, Galatians 1:19, and whom Paul identifies as an apostle, confronts Paul in Acts 21:21 about the charges that Paul is guilty of apostasia, Greek for apostasy, from which the law God gave Moses. Second, Paul complained in one of his epistles that the apostles refused to give him letters of commendation so that the Gentiles would accept Paul's teachings as authorized, thanking his listeners for accepting him without such letters based upon signs and wonders alone, the signs of an apostle. 7. Next involves the apostolic church in Acts 21 bringing forth the claim of apostasy. What is that? Apostasy is a charge that one is violating Deuteronomy chapter 13 verses 1 through 10, where one with true prophecy and signs and wonders is a false prophet solely because one tries to seduce and turn away another from the law given you. Implicitly in context, the Ten Commandments. In the Greek Septuagint translation of the Bible from 257 BC, the Hebrew word for seduce or turn away is translated in Greek in Deuteronomy 13:10 as the active verb form of apostasia, meaning to turn away. 8. In Acts 21:21, this James, known as James the Just, who was one of the apostles in Paul's mind, asks Paul to reassure everyone that Paul is not guilty of apostasia by performing a vow and ritual that comes from Numbers 6, part of the Mosaic Law. Paul complies and says nothing to dissuade James' confidence that Paul is not an apostate from the law. Paul is hanging by a thin reed here. We must wonder about what would happen when the apostles of Jerusalem find out what Paul's true views were, such as in Romans 7, verses 1 through 7. 9. The Ebionites exclude Paul's writings as written by an apostate. It does not require us to wait for long to learn the apostolic conclusion to what began in Acts 21:21, examining Paul for apostasy. The Ebionites, the Jerusalem church under the 12, as we will prove in Numbers 10 through 13 below, declared Paul's writings are excluded from being read by believers because Paul is guilty of apostasy. For example, Irenaeus, early 100s to 202 AD, wrote that the Ebionites from an early stage, quote, use the Gospel of Matthew only and repudiate Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law. Irenaeus against Heresies 126. Eusebius in 325 AD likewise said the Ebionites thought it was necessary to reject all the epistles of the Apostle Paul, whom they called an apostate from the law. Eusebius, History of the Church, 327. 10. How do we know the Ebionites were the Jerusalem church under the 12? Many proofs. First, look at how tight the connection is between Acts 21:21, where James tells Paul that he heard Paul was an apostate. Then after Paul deflects James' concern by performing a Mosaic law vow, the Ebionites find Paul as an apostate against the Mosaic law. Given Paul's epistles could not be hid for long, James and the apostles who followed Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 through 10, would have had a reasonable time after Acts 21 found out about Romans 7, verses 1 through 7. This passage, beyond all doubt, clearly makes Paul an apostate under Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 through 10. 11. Second, Ebionites was a designation at first, a common name for all Christians, as Athanasius testifies. This name meant the poor in Hebrew, from Ebion, meaning the poor. Thus, because the name Ebionites was used earliest to refer to all believers before the term Christians was first used at Antioch, it is logical to infer that this was the earliest name of the Jerusalem church under the apostles. 12. Proof for this is even in the passages of the New Testament. Paul writes in Galatians 2:10 that the apostles asked Paul to remember the poor at Jerusalem. We can now deduce Paul meant the poor, capital P, representing the Ebion of Jerusalem. For it is unlikely that the apostles singled out help monetarily for only the poor of Jerusalem, when the poor are everywhere. Thus it is no surprise that Jerome, the famous translator of the Latin Vulgate during the late 300s, explained Galatians 2:10 meant to signify the poor apostolic Jerusalem church as depicted in Acts 2, also known as the Ebion, aka the poor. Jerome's more historically correct reading for whom the poor here is meant to refer to are the Jewish believers of Acts chapter 2 verses 44 and onward. 13. More proof that the Ebionites was the name of the apostolic church was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In them, scholars found a remnant writing for the community known as the Ebion at Jerusalem, whose leader, the Zaddik, the Just One in Hebrew, was battling the spouter of lies over whether works were necessary for righteousness besides faith. They were arguing over Habakkuk 2:4. The spouter of lies insisting upon it means we are saved by belief alone. Now this same passage was used by Paul twice as a proof text for faith alone. James, the bishop of Jerusalem, was in fact known as James the Just. This fits the label Zaddik, a Hebrew word meaning just one. The debate with Paul, who often deflects charges he is lying, was over the proof text Paul misused twice, Habakkuk 2:4. It takes no stretch to deduce the Ebionites were the church of James and the 12 depicted in Acts 15. As Professor Eisenman, an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, persuasively argues about the Dead Sea Scroll document, the Damascus document has an uncanny parallel to Paul and the Just One. James the Just, as well as confirms that the name of the earliest Christians was the Ebionites. Hence, we can confidently say that the Ebionites were the same as the Jamesian Apostolic Church at Jerusalem. 15. Incidentally, this means also that the primary Dead Sea Scroll document at issue, known as the Damascus document, is further proof of the apostolic rejection of Paul. In fact, Paul says James, the bishop of Jerusalem, was an apostle, Galatians 1:19. 16. In line with the apostolic decision to exclude Paul in 62 AD, the Epistle of James the Just appears. Who was this James? He was called the first bishop of Jerusalem, Jesus' brother. As noted above, Paul called James in 57 AD an apostle, Galatians 1:19. Quote, "Other apostles of the Lord I saw none except James, the brother of the Lord." Unquote. In this epistle, James expressly refutes salvation that is by faith alone without works. See James 2, verses 14 through 24. You see that a man is justified by works, and not by faith alone. James 2:24. Luther said, "Put the dunce cap on me if you can reconcile this with Paul, namely Romans 4, verses 3 through 5, or Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. And F. Powell says, robbing Peter to pay Paul, 2009 at 67, Powell aptly says, James obviously believes that Paul is adding an erroneous tenet to the gospel. 17. Augustine, the father quoted most often by Luther and Calvin in support, likewise said that the epistle of Apostle Peter, known as 2 Peter, confirmed James's critiques, and that Peter added a critique of Paul's epistles as, quote, hard to understand. Augustine then explains Apostle Peter says that due to that flaw, many ignorant and unstable fell from Christ into lawless lives. Augustine said this carelessness was due to adopting, quote, faith alone, unquote, from reading Paul's verses that support such a view. Augustine points out that Paul contradicts faith alone in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10, and Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21. There, Augustine quotes Paul teaching believers that they will, quote, not inherit the kingdom, unquote, if guilty of various sins, which Paul enumerates. So Augustine continues, quote, apostolic epistles of 2 Peter, John, James, and Jude direct their aim chiefly against it, namely faith alone doctrine from Paul's difficult-to-understand words, so as to maintain with vehemence that faith without works profits not. Augustine, Faith and Works, republished 1847 at page 57. 18. As Augustine even confessed in the last quote in 75 AD, Jude, the third bishop of Jerusalem, and thus a subsequent successor to James's office, as well as another brother of Jesus, writes his epistle in obvious disdain once more for Paul. In Jude, George Reber, in The Christ of Paul, 1876, chapter 16, defending Paul, says, the epistle of Jude is nothing but a bolt hurled at the head of Paul. Why? Because in Jude 4 and 11, we read an obvious indictment of none other than Paul for following a different Jesus. For admission has been secretly gained by some who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly persons who pervert the grace of our God into licentiousness, and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Woe to them! For they walk in the way of Cain, and abandon themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perish in Korah's rebellion. Why is this about Paul? This persons secretly gained admission among Christians and perverted grace and favor as taught by the true Jesus, rendering it licentious. This term means unrestrained by law, lawless. These wolves in sheep's clothing thereby denied the authority of the true Lord Jesus. How so? Obviously, first because the true Jesus endorsed the law in Matthew 5:17 through 19, and because Paul's view of grace was contrary to the true Jesus' teaching in Luke 16:32 through 34 and 17:8 through 9 about a merited grace. Charis, used 4 times by Jesus. Jesus 4 times says charis, grace, is earned by exceptional good behavior beyond what sinners do. Grace does not necessarily save you in Jesus' view, but means that when God's favor, grace is upon you. Incidentally, translators never once render charis anything but credit or thanks in these Lucan passages, obscuring our ability to discern Jesus even had a message on grace. It should not surprise us. Next, Jude compares this false teacher and his followers to Cain, who resented the grace favor that a superior offering by Abel earned in God's eyes. Paul taught that earning grace this way necessarily leads to human boasting, Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 9, rather than God's favor. Grace had to supposedly be unmerited to avoid human boasting. However, this too disowns the authority of the true Jesus as Lord and Master, who speaks it contrarily. It also directly contradicts Genesis 4, verses 1 through 9, as explained at this link. Next, Jude said this person and his followers also teach Balaam's error. What was that? It was eating meat sacrificed to idols, Revelation 2:14. Something Paul endorses multiple times unless you are around a weak brother who thinks it's wrong. You refrain only if such a weak-minded brother might see you exercising the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols and violates his weak conscience. See 1 Corinthians 10:28 through 29 and 1 Corinthians 8:4 through 12. Finally, Jude compares this teacher and his followers with Korah's rebellion. What was that? Korah's rebellion was against Moses ruling over the people. See Numbers 16, verses 1 through 11. Paul's overthrow of Moses' rule over even Israel in Romans 7, 1 through 7, and Paul's exclusion of the law ever applying to the Gentiles at all is in Romans 7, 1-7 as well, and in many other places. Reber was correct. The epistle of the third bishop of Jerusalem, Jude, was a bolt hurled at the head of Paul. 19. In addition, around 68 AD, some say 97 AD, Apostle John wrote Revelation, in which Jesus spoke in clear language in Revelation 2 that Jesus condemned as a false apostle one who told the Ephesians he was one of the apostles, the 12, but was not. This fits Paul as Matthias replaced Judas in Acts 1. There was no room for a 13th apostle, as Jesus said 2 times that there would only be 12 into eternity. This was repeated by Jesus after Paul's death in Revelation 21. As Ezra Palmer Gold, a Christian professor, explained in the Bible Theology of the New Testament, Macmillan, 1900, the Apocalypse, i.e. revelation of Jesus by John, represents an unqualified opposition to Paul. The Apocalypse is anti-Pauline. Page 125. Revelation is a writing distinctly anti-Pauline. Page 131. Please note that Gold asserts without proof that an anti-Paulinist tampered with this book of Revelation. Yet this means he concedes a canonical book with Jesus' words often present as anti-Paul. 20. Jesus, in the same passage of Revelation 2:14, condemned likewise the person teaching it is okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. Paul clearly did so, only restricting doing so when around someone who thought it was wrong to do so. Hence, Jesus in Revelation 2, verses 1-14, condemned twice Paul's authority and teachings in just 14 verses. These words cannot be ignored, as they were written by a true apostle among the 12. This passage is thoroughly treated in Jesus' words only. Also, in Revelation 2:20, Jesus quotes Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 2:10, depths, in a disapproving fashion, as what the false prophetess Jezebel relies upon to teach it is okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which Paul does give permission to eat at least 2 times. For these reasons, a Paul defender, Paul Renan in St. Paul, 1875, at 220, said, Apostle John's book of Revelation was a cry of hatred against Paul and his friends. But for true Christians, this was our Savior's words warning us about Paul, not Apostle John expressing hate. 21. Next, the evidence is Apostle John supplanted Paul after Paul's death and brought the churches once under Paul's influence back to orthodoxy. This reflects again that the 12 treated Pauline doctrines of that era with disapproval. 22. Paul's writings prior to the 300s AD were found only in a separate booklet, not attached to any gospel or any epistle of anyone else. This is the P46 manuscript. 23. The early church commentators and 2 Peter spoke of Paul's wisdom, not his inspiration. See 2 Peter 3, verses 15-18. Paul speaks with wisdom in words, dysnoteus, nonsensical, difficult to understand. See also Polycarp's epistle 3:2. Neither am I able to follow the wisdom of Paul. Notice in both examples that each says that this wisdom was, quote, nonsensical, impossible to follow, or difficult to understand, hardly a commendation. 24. This is because Paul many times makes clear that he does not generally write under inspiration. The exceptions are few where Paul says something he was given by revelation, a trance, a vision, etc. See, Paul admits often he is not inspired. See also, Paul never served as a messenger of meaningful words from Christ. 25. Luther and many pro-Paul scholars admit Paul's epistle to the Galatians reflects 1. Paul's putting down the leading apostles, intending us to understand that they are, quote, false apostles, who teach another Jesus than Paul. and 2. The 12 apostles had refused to give him a commendation in writing as Paul had hoped. See Jason File, Letters of Recommendation in Early Church, at pages 70 through 72. See also Eisenman on Paul, detailing proofs that Paul did not receive any apostolic letters of recommendation. Paul thus himself impliedly admits that the 12 rejected supporting Paul's authority in the true church, which Paul hoped to receive by a written commendation. Paul had a corresponding disdain, implying the 12 were false apostles. This conflict boiled over in Paul's writings that he did not need anyone else's commendation, for he commends himself in every way, by great endurance, hard work, and through glory and dishonor, bad report and good report, genuine, and yet regarded as impostors. 2 Corinthians 6, verses 3 through 6. Hence, the refusal by the 12 to commend Paul apparently was because they regarded Paul as an impostor apostle, meaning Paul followed an impostor Jesus. 26. Finally, the Ebionites preserved first-century writings into the second of their opinions about Paul by writing the Clementine homilies and the recognitions of Clement. These works contend Peter realized that Paul, obviously revised after 325 AD by the corrupting hand of the Catholic historical editor Rufinus, to be named as Simon Magus rather than Paul, followed a different Christ, and was the enemy who teaches against the law and invites Christians to eat meat sacrificed to idols as long as not eaten in front of a Christian who thinks it's wrong. See our article, Recognitions of Clement. Blessings, Doug.